The lab was a mess. A beautiful mess, though, in the way only a scientist could appreciate. Wires snaked out from the walls like a nest of metallic snakes. Screens flickered with a dazzling array of equations, calculations, and graphs that meant nothing to most people but were poetry to Dr. Lily Zhang. She had a penchant for chaos, and this lab was a reflection of her brilliant mind, unpredictable, haphazard, but on the verge of something profound. Lily was bent over a workbench, adjusting a tiny metal component with the precision of a jeweler, her fingers moving so quickly that they seemed to blur. "Perfect," she muttered to herself, her eyes gleaming. Her lab assistants, a group of graduate students who were terrified of her, shuffled nervously behind her, looking up at her with awe. She hardly noticed them. "Dr. Zhang?" One of the assistants, Trent, cleared his throat and stepped forward. He was a tall, lanky kid who looked more like a surfer than a scientist, but he had the kind of quiet enthusiasm that made him invaluable in the lab. He held up a mug of coffee, clearly hoping it would somehow compensate for his many failures with the machine's calibration. "I fixed the thermosetting device. It should be stable now." Lily gave him a distracted thumbs up, not looking away from the circuit board. "Great. I just need the gravitational wave generator hooked up to the field coil. Can you handle that?" Trent nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am. You got it." Lily finally stood up, cracking her back with a series of pops that sounded almost ominous. Her eyes were fixed on the massive contraption in the middle of the room, an enormous, gleaming machine that hummed with energy. The prototype, a miniature black hole generator, was ready for its first test. This wasn't just any experiment. This was the kind of project that had made Lily the talk of the scientific community, the kind of project that had drawn an endless supply of funding and media attention. She had been obsessed with black holes for years. The ability to manipulate their gravitational fields, to study their effects on time and space, would revolutionize physics, space travel, and maybe even reality itself. But this was no simple task. It required precision, and Lily didn't trust anyone to do it except herself. "Okay, everyone, gather round," Lily announced, her voice cutting through the lab. The assistants instinctively moved in closer. Trent looked at the console nervously, but Lily was already in her zone, giving him no time to second-guess himself. "We're about to create a black hole. A tiny one, but a black hole nonetheless. Think of it as the universe's ultimate power ball, just on a much smaller scale." The room was silent. No one dared to laugh, but the intern standing near the back gave an awkward chuckle. Lily, never one to shy away from her eccentricities, gave him a wink. "All right," she said, tapping in commands. "Initiating Phase 1. Everyone ready?" Trent hesitated for a moment before pressing a large green button. There was a low, vibrating hum, followed by a sharp spike in the energy readings. For a moment, everything seemed fine. A small pinprick of light appeared in the center of the machine, its gravitational pull detectable on the instruments. Lily stepped forward, watching the data streams with a focused intensity. "It's working," she said, her voice filled with excitement. But then the machine suddenly shook. A high-pitched whine filled the air, and the light at the center of the machine flared brightly. "Shut it down," shouted Trent. "Something's wrong." Lily didn't move. She leaned closer to the console, her eyes wide with concentration. There was a danger here, but there was also something else, a thrill she couldn't explain. She was on the cusp of a breakthrough. This was history unfolding in real time, and she would not let it slip away. The machine flickered again. Sparks erupted from the side. And then, there was a strange sound. A whoosh, like air rushing through a tunnel. Lily felt something tug at the pit of her stomach. Before anyone could react, the beam of light shot out of the machine, swirling into a spiraling vortex that seemed to bend and twist the very fabric of space around it. Everything in the lab began to pull toward the center of the phenomenon. Papers flew off desks, tools clattered to the ground, and the walls groaned under the pressure. Lily barely had time to scream before the world turned inside out. Lily's next conscious thought was of weightlessness. She floated in a strange, black space, her body twisting in slow motion. Her first instinct was panic, but then she felt something else, a strange clarity. Her thoughts seemed sharper, clearer, and yet distorted, as if reality itself were warping around her. She blinked, and for a moment, the lab was there again, only everything was out of place. The monitors flickered. The assistants were frozen in time. The giant black hole generator had disappeared, and in its place, a rift in the air itself, a crack, glowing faintly, like the surface of shattered glass. Lily? Trent's voice came from somewhere far away. Lily, are you? She tried to respond, but no sound came from her mouth. Instead, she felt an odd pull in her chest. The rift flickered again, and she knew instinctively that it was her doing. She was the one who had caused it. The black hole particle, whatever it was, had attached itself to her, merging with her body and giving her something more than she had bargained for. Suddenly, the world around her snapped back into place, her feet hit the ground. She looked around, and to her astonishment, the lab seemed different. The air felt thicker, the lights dimmer. But it wasn't just the physical surroundings. It was her. She could feel the pull of gravity in a way she had never experienced before. It was as if her mind had synced with the fabric of the universe itself. She felt the gravitational tug of every object around her, could sense how each one was affected by her presence. Before she could process the overwhelming sensation, she instinctively reached out, and the nearest tool, a wrench, moved toward her. The wrench hovered in the air, suspended by nothing but her will. She let go, and it dropped to the floor with a loud clink. Her pulse quickened. This was impossible. This shouldn't be possible. But it had happened. She had absorbed the black hole particle, and now she had the power to manipulate gravity itself. She glanced around the lab, half expecting to see her assistants in the same state as before, but they were all moving again, though cautiously. They stared at her, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. They didn't know what had happened, but they saw the power in her. Lily? Trent whispered, his voice trembling. What did you do? Lily's thoughts raced. She had no answers, only questions. She felt the energy of the black hole particle inside her, thrumming, pulsing, alive. She could control it. For a brief moment, she wondered if she could use this to solve all the world's problems, bend time, space, and matter to her will, but deep down, she also knew that nothing this powerful came without consequences. Lily stood there, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as the tremors of the experiment continued to reverberate through the lab. The wrench hovered before her, suspended in midair like a toy. She reached out instinctively, and it shot toward her palm with a soft whoosh, as if obeying her every whim. The power was intoxicating, but there was a sharp edge to it, like a knife that could both protect and wound. She had barely scratched the surface of what she was capable of, and already, the very fabric of the room seemed to bend in response. The air was heavier, almost like the pressure had shifted. She could feel the pulse of the universe within her veins, as though the ground beneath her was no longer solid, but elastic, stretching at her will. Lily? Trent's voice trembled again, more cautious this time. Are you okay? She turned to face him. His eyes were wide, his face pale. He was standing a few feet away, his hands slightly raised as if to shield himself from whatever had just transpired. Fine, she said, though her voice didn't sound like her own. It was smoother, more measured, as though it was coming from somewhere deeper, something primal. She shook her head, trying to clear the disorienting sensation. I think I'm okay. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The black hole particle had merged with her in ways she didn't understand, and she could feel its presence within her, like a force that wasn't just in her body but in her mind. It was beginning to affect her thoughts, her very perception of reality. And if she wasn't careful, it might start to tear at the threads of the universe itself. The interns were still frozen, their eyes darting between her and the growing rift in space behind her. The rift was small, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there. Faint lines of light, like fractures in glass, spread across the air. It pulsed erratically, as if responding to Lily's emotions. "Lily," Trent said again, this time stepping forward. "What's happening? What's going on?" She glanced back at the rift. It was growing, the fractures expanding with each passing second. And with it, her own sense of time seemed to warp. Her thoughts scattered. One moment, she was perfectly aware of her surroundings, and the next, everything felt distant, as if she were standing outside of herself. She exhaled sharply, trying to concentrate. The power was so new, so unpredictable. She couldn't control it, not fully. "Not yet, everyone, get back," Lily snapped, her voice sharp and commanding. "Now." They didn't hesitate. The assistants, their faces still masks of confusion and fear, scrambled toward the door, eyes fixed on the crack that was slowly but surely tearing open space and time in front of them. It wasn't just a visual anomaly anymore. The air seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, rhythmic pulse. Lily stood still, her eyes locked on the crack. A piece of her wanted to pull it open further, to test the limits of her new ability. Another part of her, perhaps the rational part, the part that had gotten her this far, knew that it was too dangerous. The universe was already stretching at the seams, and she had no idea how to repair it. "Lily, please," Trent said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "You have to stop. It's too much. It's affecting everything. Look at the lab." Lily didn't need to look. She could feel the pull of the rift in the back of her mind, and she knew instinctively that the more she used her power, the worse it would get. Spacetime wasn't something to be manipulated so carelessly. It was delicate, fragile. And now, it was fraying. She could fix it. She could. The question was whether she could control herself long enough to figure out how, but the temptation was there. The pull of power, of knowledge. She was standing on the edge of the abyss. If she could just push a little further, understand the rift, harness it. "No," she whispered to herself. "I can't." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the tug of the rift again, more insistent now. The crack was widening. She could feel it in her chest, in the pit of her stomach. The gravitational pull was growing stronger. It wasn't just the lab that was being affected now. The very fabric of reality around her was beginning to stretch. Something inside her snapped. In a blur of motion, Lily reached out, her hand trembling. She pushed against the rift, trying to force it back. At first, there was resistance, a strange, intangible wall that she couldn't break through. But then, with a sudden surge of will, the wall crumbled. The rift sucked inward, collapsing into itself with a force that sent a shockwave through the lab. Lily stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. For a brief moment, everything went silent. Then, the crack reappeared, wider this time, more violent. "What the hell did you do?" Trent shouted. He was standing a few feet away, his hands pressed against his ears as though trying to block out the sound of the rift. I don't know." Lily gasped. She couldn't explain it. One moment, she'd tried to fix it, and the next, she'd only made it worse. "I thought I could stop it. I thought I could control it." But it wasn't just the lab that was shaking now. She could feel it, the ripple of disturbance spreading out beyond the building, beyond the city, beyond even the planet itself. She was connected to it. The rift wasn't just in her lab. It was everywhere. Her mind was racing as she tried to comprehend the full scope of what was happening. The black hole particle inside her was no longer just a strange anomaly, it was part of her. It had fused with her in ways she couldn't begin to understand, and now, it was warping everything around her. "We have to shut it down," Trent said, panic rising in his voice. Lily nodded, her mind already working, calculating. If she could just control the particle for a moment longer, she could stabilize the rift. She could reverse the damage, fix the tears in spacetime. It was possible. It had to be possible, but she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it together. She turned to the control panel, hands flying over the keys, her fingers moving faster than she had ever moved before. She was beyond rational thought now. The black hole's energy was coursing through her, and everything else, the lab, the machines, her assistants, was irrelevant. All that mattered was stopping the damage before it spread any further, but just as she was about to initiate the shutdown sequence, something happened. The rift pulsed, sending a shockwave through her body. She screamed, feeling her skin tingle with raw, electric energy, and then, the worst thing possible occurred. The rift began to widen, pulling everything toward it. Lily's world snapped. Her body felt like it was being stretched into infinity. The walls of the lab faded, and all she could hear was the low, terrifying hum of the rift, louder now, almost deafening. Time slowed, distorted, as if she were slipping through the cracks of her own existence. She could see her assistants, their faces frozen in terror, their mouths moving but without sound. The universe itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. Lily reached out again, her hands trembling. She could feel it, the fracture in time itself, the unraveling of everything. The black hole particle was growing stronger inside her, and she was losing herself in it. But she didn't have a choice. The rift had to be stopped. The ground beneath her feet was gone. The walls of the lab dissolved into mist. And for a moment, she was suspended between two worlds, one foot in reality, the other in the abyss, but she was still there. Still fighting. Still human. She reached deep inside herself, digging for the part of her that was still in control, and then, she focused all of her will on the rift. Lily felt the entire universe stretching around her, as though it were being pulled apart by an invisible hand. The air was thick with an oppressive hum, and everything, every piece of reality, seemed to quiver under the pressure. Her body trembled as she fought to maintain her grip on her own mind. The black hole particle, that tiny sliver of the universe's most dangerous force, was inside her, and it was fighting for control. It wanted to consume everything. Her thoughts, her sense of time, her very being. The rift in spacetime was no longer a small crack in the air. It had grown into a massive tear, a gaping wound that seemed to swallow everything around it. Objects hovered around it, suspended in the gravitational pull, and the air felt thick and warped, like stepping into a dream where nothing made sense. Lily reached out again, her fingers shaking, as she tried to steady herself. The particle inside her surged, and she could feel her heart racing, the pressure building in her chest. It was as if her own heartbeat was syncing with the pulse of the rift, each thud amplifying the effect of the crack in spacetime. Her surroundings flickered in and out of focus. One moment, she was standing in the lab, the next, she was somewhere else, somewhere vast and empty, where the laws of physics no longer seemed to apply. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself, to find some sliver of control. The sensation of time stretching and snapping back was maddening. The rift was consuming her thoughts, unraveling them, pushing her further into the depths of the black hole's gravitational grip. "Focus," she whispered to herself. "You can do this. You have to do this." With every ounce of strength she had left, she reached inside herself. Her hands trembled as they hovered over the air, willing the rift to close, to mend itself, to stop spreading. But no matter how hard she tried, it didn't respond. The more she pushed against it, the more it pushed back. A sickening realization began to settle over her. She wasn't just struggling to control the rift anymore. She was becoming part of it. The black hole particle inside her was fusing with her, distorting her body and mind, tearing her apart and reassembling her in ways she couldn't understand. The gravitational pull wasn't just in the lab anymore, it was in her, warping everything she was, everything she had been. Her vision blurred. Time was slipping away. In one heartbeat, she was holding herself together. In the next, the lab around her was gone, replaced by something far darker, a swirling void, an infinite abyss that seemed to stretch out forever. She was floating in it, weightless, as if she had been cast out of reality itself, and then, she saw it. The black hole. The true black hole. Not the tiny one she had created, but the immense, all-consuming one that had always existed in the far reaches of space. She could feel its pull, its gravity, its hunger. It wasn't just a force of nature. It was alive. It was conscious. It was waiting. She gasped, a sharp breath that echoed through the void, and in that moment, she realized something terrifying. The black hole wasn't just pulling her in, it was calling to her. It wanted her to merge with it, to become a part of it, to abandon the mortal world and enter into its endless darkness. Lily. Trent's voice broke through the haze, bringing her back to reality, whatever reality was now. She blinked, and suddenly, the lab was back, although it was harder to recognize. The rift had grown larger, far larger than she had expected. It stretched like a wound in the fabric of space, jagged and raw. The assistants were scattered across the room, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. She looked down at her hands. Her skin felt hot, vibrating with a strange energy. Her body seemed to pulse in time with the rift, as though her very existence was tethered to it. Lily, Trent repeated, his voice laced with fear. You need to stop this. You're tearing everything apart. Lily could feel the panic rising in him. He was right. She was tearing everything apart. The universe was splintering, and she was at the center of it all. The rift was growing with every heartbeat, and if she didn't stop it soon, it would consume the entire planet. It would consume everything. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. The rift pulsed again, and the walls of the lab shuddered. Her stomach lurched. She had no more time. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered, her voice trembling. But even as she said it, a thought flitted through her mind. A desperate, terrifying thought. She could absorb the rift. She could take its energy into herself and contain it. She had already merged with the black hole particle once. She could do it again. She could make herself the anchor for the rift, force it into submission, force it to close, but doing so would mean abandoning everything she knew. Her body, her mind, her life, all of it would be consumed by the black hole's power. She would become part of the rift, trapped in a timeless void beyond the reach of reality. She was no longer sure what was real anymore. But one thing was certain, if she didn't act, the entire universe would unravel. There was no other choice. I'm sorry, she whispered to Trent, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her over the rumbling in the air. Her voice seemed distant, as though it were coming from far away. This is the only way. Trent stepped forward, his face a mask of desperation. No, Lily. Please. There has to be another way. But she didn't hear him anymore. The rift was calling to her, pulling her in with an irresistible force. Her vision swam, and her body felt light, as if she were floating on air. The pull was too great to resist. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and reached out once more. This time, she didn't just try to contain the rift. She embraced it. Her hands hovered over the tear in spacetime, and she let the black hole's energy flood into her, feeling it course through her like wildfire. Her body burned, her mind shattered into 1,000 pieces as she absorbed the rift's power. The pain was unbearable, but it was also exhilarating. It was as if she were becoming the universe itself, existing beyond time and space, a force of nature in her own right. The rift pulsed again, and this time, it began to close. The walls of the lab shuddered and cracked as the energy surged through her, but she held firm. She could feel the rift retracting, the fabric of space and time knitting itself back together. The world was stabilizing. The chaos was subsiding, but the cost was unimaginable. She could feel herself slipping away, her body and mind dissolving into the black hole's infinite pull. Her thoughts became fragmented, distant. Her sense of self was fading, replaced by the cold, empty void of the black hole. She was becoming nothing, just a ripple in the universe's fabric, a ghost trapped in a singularity. The last thing she heard was Trent's voice, faint and distant, calling her name, and then, there was nothing.